Good evening and welcome to the NDTV Dialogues, a conversation of ideas. This week, 43 years after the imposition of emergency from 1975 to 77, we look at why it's still such a political talking point. How are the lessons of the emergency relevant even today? Joining me on that is a distinguished panel, Lalitha Kumaramangalam of the BJP, Director of the India Foundation. Also with me, Anand Sharma, Deputy Leader of the Opposition, also Professor Dipankar Gupta and Professor Mukherji of the Indian Council of Historical Research. First, for those who weren't even born when the emergency happened, let's just look at what happened in the midnight of 25th, 26th June, 43 years ago. Anand Sharma, as someone who had a ringside of the emergency, you were a member of the National Students' Union of India at that point. When you look back, do you regret it? Do you feel that as a young political leader, that this is not the way you would have wanted to start out your career?
You see, it's a complex question. You have to put things in perspective, how they evolved. It was not a off-the-cuff decision or sudden development of 25th of June 1975. There was a build-up to that. There was an agitation which was there in Gujarat, the Navnirman movement, by the students, and which led to the dissolution of the assembly and midterm elections. And yes, Chimanbhai Patel or the Congress government at that time lost, but the difference was very thin, wafer thin. There was then again the movement in Bihar, where Jayaprakash Narayanji joined. And as these movements were moving forward, there was a judgment of the Allahabad High Court, single judge, that was to declare Indira Gandhi's election to Lok Sabha from Raebareli null and void. Now, once that happened, there was this chorus that she must step down, she must leave office. And the Congress leaders at that time, we were too young. We were not involved in those discussions, but we had giants like Siddharth Shankar Ray and others. Those who were of very firm view that no, she's a popular, democratically elected Prime Minister, and there is still the Supreme Court of India, and the Supreme Court stayed that. And subsequently, it's very interesting that when she won that appeal, who were the people who wrote to her to congratulate the same year in November? But when Indira Gandhi told Jayaprakash Narayanji, she respected him a lot, like she respected Atal Bihari Vajpayee, that I am willing to prepone the elections, provided you contest, that he himself also contests, which was declined. And they said, no, you go, before the Supreme Court decided the matter. And finally, days before, open call was given to the Indian Army and the Indian police to revolt, not to accept Indira Gandhi's government's orders. Now, there was a provision which I understand as a student of law then in the constitution, which in that situation, when you are giving that open call, which was the then cabinet decided, or the then law minister, and that was invoked. So I will say, to sum it up, it was an aberration, and Indira Gandhi herself regretted it. So 43 years after that, I fail to understand that why. India has moved on. Our democracy is there. Today, without that provision being there in the constitution, we see subversion of our institutions which actually uphold our democracy and the foundational values of the constitution. So we have to put things in perspective how it happened.
I'll come back to you on that point, because of course we had that controversial comparison of Hitler and Indira Gandhi as well. I'll come back to you on that. But Lalitha ji, if I can bring you back in on that, because really different perspective given by Anand Sharma ji, the Congress perspective perhaps, but in a sense, there is a political legacy which has come on where many people were in very different positions then, now have taken different political positions in their career. We've seen your late father, of course, was a great favorite in the sense of Indira Gandhi, and one of the most controversial aspects of supersession of judges, which happened before the emergency, was brought in at that time. But how long are we going to look back and blame perhaps people in history without moving forward and seeing how do we make sure that the same impulses don't occur again, as Anand Sharma says. He says that we've got a similar situation in a different layers perhaps, but it's a similar situation today.
Look, it's undeniable that my father was considered one of Indira Gandhi's kitchen cabinet and was responsible for piloting many of the very controversial bills, privy purses and many of those constitutional amendments, 22, 23, 24. But my politics is different. I doubt if people would call me rightist, but even if they do, these terms today don't really matter much. It's just that my viewpoint is that whatever have been the background of what led to the emergency being declared, the fact was that those 21 months were extremely draconian. And maybe she was insecure. I was a young girl then. I mean, the whole family was in politics. My brother was then the head of the NSUI. He had just, and the way the emergency played out was extremely draconian. You know that there was that famous editorial in the Times of India where, 3 days after that, press censorship was put in. It was not just the Gujarat government that was dismissed, it was also the Tamil Nadu government. And the worst thing was when the amendment to the constitution that was brought in, which said that no emergencies or decisions were taken during emergencies, national or in the state, can be questioned by the Supreme Court. Actually, if you ask me personally, I feel that the supersession of judges itself was the first step towards the weakening of the three-legged institution that democracy in India stood on. What the constitution laid out, even though it was my father who was responsible for it. I will say that today.
No, I think that's a very...
I would not have agreed with him had I been old enough to know what was going on. But the fact is that, even the letter that was written to the President of India then, Fakhruddin Ali Ahmad, was actually drafted by Siddhartha Shankar Ray. He was then CM of West Bengal. He wasn't in the center. So whatever you may say about the cabal or whatever you want to call them that surrounded Indira Ji, she took the decision herself. Of course, there was a huge influence on her by Sanjay Gandhi. That is what also is, I think, very disturbing to people of my age, perhaps, or maybe not all the youth of today, that it became what it wasn't earlier, a sort of very, very family-dominated politics of repression.
I think what's interesting, and I think that's a very candid admission, and family and especially daughters are entitled not to agree with their fathers. But what's interesting is that how the BJP, including the Prime Minister, will today blame Rahul Gandhi for the emergency as well. So how is it fair that when many key characters of the emergency, Maneka Gandhi is a minister in the Union Cabinet, your father had a role, many others, V.C. Shukla then went ahead and joined the BJP. Why is it that some people generations later are accountable for the age? Like, why would Rahul Gandhi in a sense be accountable for the emergency?
You see, what I think is being tried to be said by many people, I have no intention of getting into any personality this thing, is that unfortunately, and this is again according to me, having had a ringside view of the Congress since I was born, if not before, that the party has become more and more dependent on only a small, or not even a small, a very limited number of leaders. Now, I am not familiar enough with the lower echelons of the Congress, I have to admit that, to pass judgment on whether there are good or bad and all of that. And it's not my party, I don't wish to go into it. But the fact is that there is very limited space, except perhaps at the state level, for people to grow within that party. I'm not talking about their background. All of this has been debated, you know, till the crows come home.
The glass
almost.
ceiling, basically. So
I'm saying that the glass ceiling didn't exist. Not when I saw my father as minister, or even my grandfather. I was a baby then. But even then, that didn't exist. There was space for much more discourse, much more, for want of a better word, disagreement even within the party. It's just not there here today.
But that's a separate point on whether Rahul Gandhi is accountable for his grandmother's sins.
But that came out of perhaps what was the emergency attitude or thinking mindset, if you want to put it that way. I may be wrong and people may disagree with me, but I've really seen the Congress up close.
Anand Sharma, I'll come back to you on that, but I want to get the apolitical view. So, Dr. Gupta, if you can really come in on that, because it's interesting when we talk really in the sense of how many parties have actually shared links in a sense, or different parties and different, as an apolitical person during the emergency, what are the lessons you feel are still relevant today? Why is the emergency politically relevant? Do you think it is at all, or does India need to just look ahead? Or do you think it's actually crucial to look at today? Is there, do you think, any similarity in what's happening today and then, or was that a completely specious comparison?
Well, first and foremost, I'm not apolitical.
Are you not? Okay.
No, I don't belong to a political party. That's true, but that doesn't make me apolitical, because I do have political views and I like to engage with them. In the sense that, you know, when we talk about the emergency, one can get wrapped up in the past, which is a bit dangerous. But what one should also look at, and this is a point that both my panelists have been talking about, is what are the lessons we can learn. Now, I believe that one major lesson that we must learn is the weakness of our institutions. I think what Mrs. Indira Gandhi did was that she actually exposed that weakness, and she herself may have been one of the persons who, you know, made it happen much more dramatically. But the fact of the matter is, our institutions have never been strong, and this is something we must really worry about. Now, post-emergency, there have been lots of things have happened. There have been the Babri Masjid, there have been riots everywhere, there's been the Sikh killings, all of that stuff. And what does it tell you at the end of the day? They do tell you really that our institutions are weak. That's the most important thing we should think about. So rather than getting fixated... The Supreme Court has often been
the last bastion in a sense when...
I'm sorry?
The Supreme Court has often, the Election Commission in fact has often stood up at a time when it seemed the executive had failed in its duty.
It's a good idea for the Supreme Court to stand up, but that's one institution which has also been assaulted from all sides, by the way. It doesn't stand, you know, in imperial grandeur. But the point really is there is not one or two institutions that matters, the whole set of things that matter. And that is what is really worrying. For example, when you talk about people taking law into their own hands, they've been doing it for a long, long time. And they got away with it. And why is that so? Because the institutions are weak. I believe that one major lesson we should learn from the emergency is, of course, we should all say that, you know, cross our hearts, we'll never allow this to happen again. But other than that, we should really examine and self-critically examine our situation and confess on bended knees perhaps that every party is actually responsible for weakening of institutions. And we must play our role in strengthening them. You know, there are many issues that came up during the emergency. One is, you mentioned the family issue, which was, as you know, a blatant slap on the face of any institutional structure. The other is that there have been movements, genuine democratic movements, that have been stifled on grounds which are completely unacceptable by any democratic standards.
43 years after the emergency, perhaps a good way for political parties to talk about is to look at how to strengthen our institutions. So, Dr. Mukherji, if you could come in, because there's often been criticism that history was always looked at through one perspective before 2014, in a sense that now we've seen many more think tanks, many more historical research centers have a different perspective. We're now seeing that the emergency, Prakash Javadekar says, our textbooks are now going to look at it much more critically than it has already been. Do you think re-looking what the lessons are of emergency is important in 2018? Why are we harking back to 43 years ago? Or do we need to look also at democracy and how it's being strengthened today in 2018? That's what we should be examining.
In a lighter vein, you know, if people don't look back at history, then historians will lose jobs, you know, fine. Having said that, I think I will take a few things. Our institutions were not, I think, basically very weak. If you keep in mind the legacy that we had 200 years of British rule and before that Islamic rule, you know, that our constitution makers gave a fairly good constitution. I think it often happened, and it has to happen, you know, because we brought out a parliament democracy in a very few years' time, you know. England worked for 700 years, beginning from Magna Carta, you know, and adult manhood franchise came only late 20th century. So it's a long process, and what we try to do is to do it in a very, very short period of time. And keeping in mind the linguistic diversity, the educational differences, economic problems, actually our constitution makers didn't do a bad job. It's the people behind those who are running the administration, you know, they are of, I mean, sorry to say, not of very good quality altogether, you know. I'll take up Mr. Anand Sharma's point, you know, that in the process I'll be discussing few things, that actually Congress as a party felt more and more vulnerable late 60s onwards, you know, when for the first time, the Sanjukta Vidhayak governments came. Charan Singh came in UP, Mahatma Prasad Singh came in Bihar, Ajay Mukherji came in Bengal. So Congress was facing a threat. And then when Mrs. Gandhi took over, there is a fight between the old Congress, the syndicate, Reddy, Sanjeeva Reddy, Atulya Ghosh and things like that, they were thrown out. And then of course inside Congress, very powerful people like Chandrasekhar, called the Young Turks. So Congress was facing a problem. And you see, I'm from Bihar actually, so, and 70s all throughout, people in administration families, you know, so I moved in the districts also. I knew that people were very, very unhappy. And Jaiprakash Narayan was from Bihar, and we also knew Jaiprakash Narayan to some extent as students of history. And there's a great feeling, also students of Delhi University, you know, people used to say that if the election Congress will lose, you know, I mean, that is something, you know, like a sacrilege. Congress will lose with Mrs. Gandhi there, but people who are in the movement, they said Congress might lose, you know. So Congress was on very weak grounds, you know. And there's no denial of the fact that in some of the state governments, which in Bihar is a terrible administration, most corrupt. Punjab Karan Sahab was there.
So the reason you feel was political rather than it was a political reason for the imposition of emergency because she was feeling threatened?
Yeah, I think so. I will tend to think so. Yes.
I just want to bring in Anand Sharma ji on some of the bits discussed already, but Mr. Sharma, the whole point we had Arun Jaitley comparing Indira Gandhi with Hitler this week, but also interestingly often the comparison made is between Indira Gandhi and Narendra Modi, saying that actually the impulses of both are much more similar than the prime ministers in between. So when you look at comparisons of two strong prime ministers, it's Indira Gandhi and Narendra Modi. So when you call one a dictator, perhaps either both are dictators or both aren't.
I think it would be unkind, as long as we have a parliamentary democracy, to call Indira Gandhi a dictator. Or for that matter, with any comparison between Indira Gandhi, who was a child of the freedom movement, who participated in the freedom struggle, who understood and saw from very close quarters not only what Mahatma Gandhi was thinking, but what the leaders of Free India, those who gave us the constitution that Professor Mukherji just referred to. And so she came from a different perspective, which was very well informed, and her understanding and comprehension of how we became independent and our history and who were participants and who were not. But the important issue is there cannot be a greater injustice but to make this absurd comparison between Indira Gandhi and Hitler. It is outrageous. Why I say so? Indira Gandhi was a popular leader. I know that my friend Mr. Arun Jaitley has said it, and he should not have, because he is an informed person. Dictators do not believe in people's verdicts. Dictators do not hold elections. What is being forgotten conveniently, and a selective loss of memory on the part of Prime Minister, if he appreciates history at all, the fact that it was Indira Gandhi who in January 1977 lifted the emergency, called for elections, censorship was lifted, free and fair elections were held. She herself lost, Sanjay Gandhi lost, Congress lost, and she accepted the verdict with humility. So dictators do not accept popular verdicts. There is no transfer of power, number one. But what is equally important, what is equally important is to bear in mind that even that decision was a painful decision for Indira Gandhi, not to hold the elections, but the imposition of emergency. You know, she regretted it. She was not aware, she had no intention that the administration in districts and different parts of the country, they will misuse it, they will misuse the
But
powers,
Anand Sharma,
and atrocities will be committed.
That's your view, but just to ask...
It's not my view, that's historically
correct.
correct.
But how does the Congress then call Prime Minister Modi a dictator?
No,
by the same logic of accepting elected verdicts, then isn't that double standards?
Let me tell you, no double standards. Prime Minister Modi is authoritarian because we have a cabinet form of government. There is complete centralization of authority, decision making and policy making. No cabinet minister has...
But that's similar to Indira Gandhi as well.
No, I'm sorry. Cabinet, I've been a cabinet minister for long.
The cabinet.
No, that's separate. But the cabinet ministers would move the notes. Cabinet ministers would move the policy papers. Here it is all done from the PMO. Cabinet ministers will choose their secretaries who head the civil service. Today, if there is one lucky minister who can appoint his own private secretary, that's different. In every office of every minister, there is an OSD who belongs to the so-called social cultural organization, which is hypocrisy to claim, the RSS. So in every office, and BJP governments in every state, every minister's office, every chief minister's office. This is the subversion of the cabinet system. Similarly, when you look at the appointments committee of the cabinet, it's only the prime minister who signs it. He was reminded that for a committee, you have to have 2 people. So then Home Minister was added. Please go by notifications. But Home Minister has admitted in Parliament that all the files come to him post facto after PM has signed.
Let me just bring in
so
Lalitha
it's fait accompli.
Also on this argument which Anand Sharma ji has just made, that in this comparison, that when you look at Narendra Modi today and the Congress calling today an undeclared emergency, do you see any similarities?
I don't think so. I think it's basically, well, it's quite irrelevant and it's quite ridiculous to compare it. Indira Gandhi was an extraordinarily powerful prime minister.
Do you agree with the dictatorial, authoritarian aspect which Anand Sharma ji raises about the prime minister?
No, I really don't, because I do know many of the ministers who are in the cabinet. I've worked with them since 2000 when I joined the BJP. And I did have a choice to join any party I wanted. But that's a different issue. Now, it's unfair to say that ministers like Arun Jaitley, and I think Mr. Anand Sharma knows Arun ji well enough to know that I'm saying the truth, like Nitin Gadkari ji. He's not actually the Home Minister at all. Anyway, people like Nitin Gadkari ji, like Arun Jaitley ji, etc. There are several of them, Nirmala Sitaraman ji, Sushma ji. These are not puppets. They are not going to be dictated to, even if it is a Prime Minister who's come in after 30 years with such a sweeping majority. Perhaps Mr. Modi's, you don't agree with his politics. That's a different thing. You don't have to agree with his politics if you don't want to. But to call him dictatorial is ridiculous, according to me.
But the Congress called him Aurangzeb this week. They didn't just call him dictatorial, they called him Aurangzeb.
I wish they'd met Aurangzeb, then they'd know what the difference is. But the fact is that perhaps Indira Gandhi was not dictatorial throughout her regime. But certainly during the emergency, she was. It was being run as a dictatorship, not just by her, I have to admit, also her younger son, Sanjay Gandhi, was very much a part of it. Many people say that it was, and many people agree, that it was Sanjay Gandhi who perhaps sort of fed into her insecurity, that made her bring in something like the 42nd Amendment. Basically, if you go through the amendment, it's really a hit against civil liberties of people.
But do we need to move, you are saying, do we need to move on? Like by focusing so much on those 2 years of emergency, do we also do a disservice in a sense?
No, but that was also, as I said, it was part of the weakening of the organizations that we're talking about that are supposed to be the tripod, the three-legged concept that our constitution laid out for us. Today, the Supreme Court is a much weakened, sometimes I think not spectator, it would be unfair to call them that, but a much weakened institution. So perhaps at times is the Election Commission. And these are vital organizations that help to maintain democracy in this country. Remember that the movement when Indira Gandhi had declared emergency was not anti-her. It was called Movement to Save Democracy.
Let me just bring in Dipankar Gupta on the other point we said, because really let's look at what's seen as when I said Indira Gandhi and Prime Minister Narendra Modi, the comparison that we do, that we like authoritarian, dictatorial, because it often implies a sense of strength. Is that when we talk about emergency today, when we look at Indira Gandhi, just the perspective of those 2 years, are we ignoring Are we blurring the two things? When we say undeclared emergency today, when Anand Sharma ji talked about, not giving the minister the freedom to appoint his own private secretary, do we mix up issues but look also at authoritarian as necessarily a bad thing? How would you see that? And can you compare that to emergency of 1975 to 77?
Right off the bat, authoritarianism is a bad thing. Okay, so let's not argue on that point. Number two, I don't have a ringside seat. I can only tell you things from the outside, though I'm not apolitical. I observe things, and what happens to normal people like me who are not in the political center stage, I can speak from that point of view. And obviously there'll be difference of perspective.
Sure.
Now, what I see as the most important thing, as I said earlier, is the sort of basic weakness of institutions. You take anything. You said Indira Gandhi was shaken by the fact that there were movements happening all over the country, that several states had become non-Congress states, that even Jayaprakash Narayan had asked the army and the police to rebel. Now, the fact that you believe all this, you don't trust your army and police. I mean, they are solid institutions. Why should you even think that because Jayaprakash Narayan is saying so, they're going to, just walk out of barracks and join him in a movement? That's not true. That shows that, people who are in leadership positions are not so sure about their own institutional structures. Why? Because they have been so often perjured by them. They have done it. Now, when you talk about Sanjay Gandhi coming in to the political firmament, it's true that this was the first time such a thing happened in such an obvious form. Indira Gandhi's induction was much more laid back, one might say. Sanjay Gandhi's was very, very, obvious and blatant and in your face. And that did change a lot of things. So that when they say that Rahul Gandhi is responsible for the emergency, I don't think they're making a descriptive empirical statement. What they're making is a metaphorical statement. They want to flash certain emotions in front of you. They don't want to describe things accurately. And much of politics is metaphorical. You sort of excite emotions.
So when we say undeclared emergency when the Congress says today, do you think there's any comparison?
I don't think you should compare anything with anything, because when you talk about what happened in Turkman Gate, what happened during those years of emergency, what happened in the Sikh killings, what happened in Babri Masjid, what happened to the cow vigilantes, all of these are separate tragedies, and one should see them as such. And by trying to collapse them, what happens really is that we sort of airbrush them. We don't see the gravitas behind each death, which is so numbing for families and for people close by. And that is the reason why I'm always a little suspicious of these broad brush sweep strokes, because they do conceal more than they reveal. And to me, that's dangerous. And I must come back to it again and again, though I seem to be belaboring a point that is probably known to all. And that is, we may have a good constitution, but that constitution has been amended so many times. We had the same constitution, which was then, the various acts that came up, which Lalitha ji talked about during the emergency. So the constitution is open to multiple interpretations. What really matters is how solidly are we in favor of institutional solidity. That is the most important thing. And how do we keep that going? So by comparing X with Y, we forget that kernel, which to me is the most important thing.
Dr. Mukherji, if I can bring you in on that.
One last point.
Yes?
Remember, during that period, it is not just the Congress and Jayaprakash Narayan. There was George Fernandez. There were the communists. There were a whole host of people.
It came across the world.
In the spectrum. And all of them were caught in it. And what was the reason for that? The reason for that, very simply, as a first principle, is poor institutional structure, and none of us recognized it. We saw it as a person who was wrong. Maybe that's true. But behind the person,
what was the Supreme Court, what were the press, what were other aspects? Dr. Mukherji, because if you look at that point, so you've suddenly also had a host of perhaps ex-BJP Yashwant Sinha coming out this week saying that we can't compare the two, but it is in many ways a different kind of emergency-like situation that we see today. L.K. Advani ji in 2015 said, I can't say that an emergency will not happen again. When you look at today, and let's not look at what happened with Indira Gandhi, but when you look at today, do you feel that in universities, and you've of course been a university professor, you were a young professor when the emergency happened, what do you think of these comparisons that are made?
This is very absurd. I think this is a black propaganda. Is being said that this government is also turning very authoritarian. You see, just few examples, very broad examples. Most of the senior ministers in the government, they continue to hold the same position, say Home Minister, Defense Minister, Home Minister, Finance Minister. In Congress regime, I think every 6 months, 1 year, the senior ministers will change, you know.
I never changed for 5 years. I held the same post for years. And I was a senior minister.
Then secondly, I don't think there's any emergency on the media, because I know I used to write in the media, English newspapers, and I know how even letters to editors would not be published by so-called big papers, you know. Television studios, television channels, anchors like you can say anything like you know. I have never heard of any mass arrest so far. And you see, as for the academia...
Thank God you're saying so far.
No. Yes, so far, yes, because I can't predict the future, but nothing like this can happen.
Anand Sharma ji, go ahead. You've been wanting to...
No, I want to just make a couple of points. First of all, when we are talking of emergency, democracy and the constitution, one thing must never be forgotten, and I want to say it emphatically, that Indira Gandhi was a leader and 1980 settled the debate. It is the same people, you must not forget. Those who were prosecuting her, persecuting her, tormenting her, the Shah Commission was set up. What came out of that? Cases which were made, though people may find it laughable today. You asked the former President Pranab Mukherji that one of the charges against Indira Gandhi before the Shah Commission was that when she went to Imphal in Manipur, she stole 6 chickens which were cooked in the circuit house. This is one of the charge. Read out what the findings of the Shah Commission were. Indira Gandhi never denied. She was an honest person. There may have been excesses, and which was, nobody can condone them.
So you're saying it needs to be a closed chapter
now?
No,
but what I'm saying, the people closed it. 1979, when she started the campaign, 78 she won back from Chikmagalur. And when she came victorious, within days she was expelled from parliament. She was sent to prison by a privileges committee findings, which was dominated by the then ruling party. And there was mass uprising against that. People did not like what was being done to Indira Gandhi. And when she started campaigning, there were violent attacks on her convoys. People like Yani Zail Singh were brutally assaulted. And the RSS and the BJP, at that time the Jansangh cadres were there. And I must want to say that why something must be known, which maybe you do not know one fact, that it was the RSS chief at that time, Balasaheb Deoras, who wrote to Indira Gandhi within 2 months, 22nd of August 1975, supporting the emergency. He again wrote to her congratulating her winning the election appeal in November 1975 and asked for lifting of the ban. He was in Pune jail, and then he gave the same undertaking which was given by Balasaheb Deoras' predecessor, Golwalkar ji, to Sardar Patel after Mahatma Gandhi's assassination. So please, and the same people today are talking, same RSS people. I will be very happy if Javadekar writes about books on emergency period. And my honest submission is, let him put Sardar Patel's order in the book. Let him put those letters of supporting emergency, that we will, our Sangh will be our strength, that we will propagate, we will go, we will campaign for this, popularize the 20-point program. These are all documents which are in public domain. I am not making up. But last point which I want to make, the people of India brought her back with 2/3 majority, 353 seats in the Lok Sabha. That's what she won. So and those who were vilifying her were actually condemned by them to the dustbin.
And then
go by the results of that period.
No, exactly.
And even in defeat, you know, everybody is talking of 77 defeat. Even in 77 defeat, Congress had 154 Lok Sabha seats, which she accepted, and 35% vote.
No, so that's an
Prime Minister Narendra Modi, in the peak of his popularity and the tsunami of 2014, got only 31% vote, the entire NDA.
So you're saying so election verdicts, in a sense, are the final verdicts on
that issue was settled.
In history. No, so many other chapters, exactly, whether it's 1984, 2002, then
you talk of what is happening today, the subversion of institutions.
I agree with you.
What's happening to the judiciary
look at today. So in fact, Lalitha ji, one interesting aspect, the Prime Minister talked about how even Kishore Kumar's songs were banned on All India Radio at that time. And it was interesting. But I do have to say that I did also, that one similarity that did strike me is that, for instance, when an Amir Khan speaks out, if a Shah Rukh Khan speaks out, if an actor speaks out today in something which is even seen as vaguely critical of either the Prime Minister or the current government, look at what happens to them. It may not be a boycott in a sense imposed so with a hammer like the Congress government may have done then, or VC Shukla may have done then, but it's a virtual boycott in the same kind. It's for instance, just look at what happened with Sushma Swaraj. When even Sushma Swaraj talked of the abuse that was hurled at her by online trolls, many of them followed by BJP ministers, the BJP is silent. It's a different kind of censorship. It's a different kind of being careful what you say. It may not have anything to do with the emergency,
social
but
media
it is still
has
censorship.
nothing to really do with political beliefs.
It's not superficial. When it's followed by BJP ministers, it's not
Let me say,
Social
social media is
social media, Twitter.
look, social media is
blessing by the BJP
emergency.
ministers. Go ahead.
I don't think it has the blessing of anybody. Like I told you, many people on all sides are not very happy with social media. Unfortunately, it has become an arena for abuse almost. And many of us don't even participate in it. What happened to Sushma ji was undoubtedly not only regrettable, it was despicable. And I don't think it's very unfair to say that the BJP supported it. Possibly most people didn't want to get into that. It's very dirty. Many people, I mean, I wouldn't have got into that sort of really very dirty sort of atmosphere and argument. But that's unfortunately what social media has become today increasingly. But I'd also like to remind Anandji that Mr. Modi is also democratically elected PM. Yeah, there are comparisons made about the authoritarian style, etc., etc. I think all comparisons are odious. When she came back in 1980, yes, she came back with a huge majority. But so has Mr. Modi been voted in. He hasn't grabbed power and anything of that sort.
We were comparing about
you
people
can
having
disagree
rejected
with,
Indira Gandhi. The same
Mr.
people
Anand,
saw
should
through.
let me finish.
No,
I never
but
don't
the people
interrupt.
brought her
So
back.
you really should let me finish.
No, go ahead,
it's okay
Lalitha
if you don't want to hear what I want to say, but let me say what. Now, what I'm saying is that we need to look at the emergency not only from an individual perspective, but also from the collective perspective of this country. The amendments that were brought in at that time were really draconian, and they laid the basis. And I'm saying this very frankly. I know people will say it was your father who did this. He did, and like I said, I do not agree with perhaps what he did that time. But the fact is that, you know, the checks and balances that used to exist in the system were destroyed during the emergency, and that has unfortunately made our institutions weaker. One has to admit that.
So do you think in 2018, when 4 Supreme Court judges have a press conference, when the whole question is raised on who will actually be the successor of Justice Mishra, could it possibly be a supersession of the next in line? Do you think that then those are valid concerns today, that because the Supreme Court checks and balances are
by the way, there have been supersessions in the past.
Yes, but
Yeah,
do you think today,
A.N. Ray was the person who brought in, who allowed the 42nd Amendment.
I'm sorry, but I think. Yeah, I'm sorry. You were finishing.
No. A.N. Ray was the person who superseded the Justice Hagde,
So
etc.
supersessions
And
had
he was the
happened
one
in
who
the
allowed the 42nd Amendment to go through.
So do you think it happened again in 2018? Do you think that today what's happening in the Supreme Court
No, I don't
inspires
think there
confidence
is
in
going
you?
to be any supersession at all. To speculate what's going to happen, I'm talking about what has happened. I don't think there's going to be a supersession. That seems to be in many people's imaginations. I don't think it's going to happen.
So do you think the Congress charge that today the Supreme Court, that the 4 judges coming out and speaking in public, do you think the Supreme Court is today?
Look, I'm not a
strong as
lawyer. So, but if you talk to a lot of people who are lawyers from all sides of the spectrum, political and those who are not in politics, they will tell you that the Supreme Court has its own system of solving its problems internally. I'm sure there have been judges who've disagreed with each other in the past. I don't think it's possible in a democracy as vibrant as India, where everybody, even at the Nukkad tea stall, has a political opinion, that there could not have been dissensions within the court. Probably what is most regrettable is that it didn't really need to come out in the public. Ultimately what happened was it weakened the Supreme Court, not individual judges at all, because Dipak Mishra kept his cool, and it became too political, which perhaps is not what should be made of the Supreme Court. It has its own prestige. Unfortunately, that prestige has been, I don't want to use terms that are
I'm going to come back
has been questioned.
on that, but Professor Gupta, just that point I made about, let's leave the emergency side, but let's just look at what's happening today. I mean, of social media, Twitter didn't exist at the time of the emergency, but we look at a completely different landscape, and a landscape where the opposition and where media, civil society may well say that for expressing particular views, whether you're a film star, whether you're a television anchor, whether you're a student, does bring consequences which may or not be so directly done by a government or this thing, but is somehow approved tacitly or silently approved of? When a person follows you on Twitter, he may not endorse it, but it is an endorsement. Why would he be following you otherwise, especially if you are in a position of power?
Well, I know for a fact that, as we've been talking about, that Twitter can be quite a nasty instrument, and it's something one should really stay away from unless you're compelled by political and journalistic reasons to stay on. Otherwise, it does more damage than good. Having said that, I must also insist upon one fact. That is, we pay too much attention to elections. And why do I say that? I say that because I don't think people are that wise. If you think wisdom resides in the people, you're wrong. The only way in which a good democracy can work is if leaders set the parameters for discussion, debate, and governance. And that is the most important thing. Whenever leaders falter on that score, things go wrong. Authoritarianism is exactly the opposite of democracy, because here the leaders are actually reneging on their job. Their job is to keep institutions in place. Their job is to make sure that citizenship thrives. But when they don't do that, then all kinds of mad people enter the scene. People in general are not actually democratic in character. They like authoritarian regimes. They say, wow, this is happening. The person has a point of view. Trains will run on time. Donald Trump, Erdogan, all of these people, Putin, they're all elected, popularly elected people. So if you were to say that people have elected them and therefore they are fine, that's one way of looking at it. But my way of looking at it is this, that leaders have a role to play in a democracy. They cannot sit back and be night watchmen. They have to be proactive, and the most profitable proactive thing they could ever do is to uphold institutions. Because institutions will not stay in place on their own. You've seen a very long-lasting democracy like America, and that country is facing a severe crisis of institutions today, because leadership is really the key to the whole thing. So for which reason I believe that it is not he said and she said. It is about how committed are leaders to institutional firmness.
So you don't believe there's this whole sense of false hype propaganda?
No. I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying that if you feel that this is because there is something happening, the people in the country are moving a certain direction, my point of view is that don't trust the people always to say the right thing. The leaders should play a role as well. And by the way, perception is a social fact. If you perceive that way, that too is a social fact. As much of a social fact as when somebody is killed for whatever, Go Raksha or whatever.
Dr. Mukherji, go ahead. Do you feel that there is a sense of fear? The Congress says there's a sense of fear. Some activists will say there's a sense of fear. Do you feel there's a sense of fear for speaking out? How do you look at this whole aspect of lynchings? We've seen articles this week also talking about the fact that the difference perhaps that time was that the emergency was not communal. That today what the situation is that there is a communal undertone. So don't compare to the emergency, but look at what's happening as a different kind of emergency.
You see, what to discuss communal, this communalism is nothing new in India, this has been going on for centuries. So second thing, what we should remember, cutting across all political parties, that during emergency, extra constitutional authority became very, very important, around the person of Mrs. Gandhi and her son. And Shah Commission, as I used to attend sessions and sessions Shah Commission, I have gone through that also, reports, and I know what happened. So that's one thing, serious. Then petty officials, district level downwards, they become very arrogant, very ruthless. How, villages are villages, people who are lifted, taken in official cars and sterilized.
Agreed, but now if we look now at 2018.
This is, yeah. So do you think these things happening now? No. So these are the things, which we should guard against, This is our high watermark, This is what has been done.
No, but do we need to look at different aspects of what's happening today? As I said, completely in a different context.
Very superficial, very frivolous argument, just for political arguments, Nothing like this there, Tell me how many politicians have been arrested. You see the kind of language some chief ministers speak against Prime Minister Modi. Mamata Banerjee's language,
What? So you're saying it's superficial?
Let me also add that all the lynchings are certainly not communal. All of this thing that's happening now recently is because I think as a society also we've changed. Violence seems to have become very almost internalized. What was it? Those two young boys who were killed because people suspected that there was child trafficking going on. And this is where I say that social media has perhaps in some ways done a lot of bad things. Has been more bad than good in some cases. Not always, perhaps. It has given people access to information, etc.
Which is why you shouldn't see the popular voice as a good voice.
I disagree with you there,
Probably
because you know, in a
anti-BJP
democracy,
social
regardless of
network
what
is
we say
very
is good or bad,
well
people have
oiled
the
and
right
well
to
organized.
choose good or bad.
Let
That
me,
is the democracy.
let me bring in Anand Sharma on that point, because perhaps does this do a Congress a disservice? Perhaps the comparisons which may seem misplaced, because let's look at it, as we said, as two different aspects. Let's look at what's happening today. When, for instance, the Congress says, oh, we should, an impeachment of the Chief Justice of India, the Prime Minister just brought up last week, but yet the Congress applauds the same Supreme Court when they give a judgment favourable to the Congress in the Karnataka case. So they do seem to be, the Congress does tend to swing from extreme to extreme.
Nothing personal. There were issues which, unfortunately, I'll use the word, had to be brought out in the open. The fact is that there is interference today in the judiciary. Yes, Professor Dipankar Gupta is right that there was supersession in the past, even that's a matter of fact and record. Nobody can deny. And it's not a question of endorsing it. But after the judgments in the advocates on record case, the first judge case, the second judge case, that issue of appointment of judges is also settled. That is where, when there is delay, I was chairing a parliamentary committee which was dealing with this matter of the appointment of judges and the delay, and we had called for certain papers, and though it was our right as opposition, then it was settled in 2014 which committee, which party will chair, and the principal opposition party, but it was abruptly taken away, the chairmanship, because we were dealing with certain very sensitive matters, and the government of the day then moved. We know where the bona fide concerns were. I entirely agree with what Professor Gupta says. Institutional integrity, institutions that sustain our constitutional democracy, what even Lalitha ji has said about the balance between the three, the legislature, the judiciary and the executive. That's very important. And equally important is vigilance in a democracy. That is what the media is doing. And we have to have an alert media. We have to have a media which expresses itself objectively and freely, because perception in politics, in democracies matter. And besides perception, it's also the way the narratives are built. Whether you are building a narrative on hyper-nationalism, whether you're questioning the patriotism of other citizens, when some of the lynching may not be communal, but some when it happens and it's in full public view, when everything is video recorded, and then those who are the perpetrators go scot-free, that's where the faith is shaken when it comes to the institutions. So this has to be borne in mind.
Right. So final thoughts, when we look at emergency of 75 to 77 and when we look at 2018, why do we even compare the two? Is there any sense of comparison? And do we need to look at 2018 as a time when we should actually do a reality check or look ahead at what we can do to curb any kind of impulses, whether you say they're frivolous social media, whether you say, oh, these lynchings are isolated incidents, but are there worries today in 2018? Dr. Mukherji.
I don't think so. I don't see any say signal for anything bad like that, you know. Okay, it's like this, as society, people get more and more educated and people get empowered, people get politically conscious, so naturally lots of things will be said, people will become very critical. Now people are very critical the way they are not 25-30 years back, you know. So criticism is always good, but you see, unfounded allegations do grave damage. I was listening to some TV channels on Pakistan report, you know, and they are just citing the allegations made by the opponents of the BJP, you know. They say you are killing Dalits, you are doing that, you know, like that. We want Modi to be there for 5 years so that all your problems are solved, things like that, you know. So I think our opposition should behave more in a reasonable way. I mean, they shouldn't make it a aap tu my thing, you know, which is happening, you know. I mean, you shouldn't blow up things, you know, because you see, it's nothing. I don't see any opposition leader has been arrested. Any state government dismissed. It was common. 1959 onwards, when Panditji was there, for the first time a communist government. I'm not a communist. I have campaigned as communist all my life. But the first time a communist government was dismissed, you know. When the Muslim League was brought up by Panditji, Muslim League was brought up by Mrs. Gandhi, you know. Now these things happened, you know.
Yeah. Are you playing the hands of Pakistan and the opposition raised the issue? The surgical strikes video released this week.
This is again a communal overtone which should not be there. Second thing is, when it comes to, you see, so much has been, I wish if we had 3 sessions
So it's
I'm a
similar
student
to
of
Indira
history,
Gandhi
not
ji
a
in
historian.
1975 saying national security and we're saying national security
Let me tell
again
you today, what is worrisome is a clear abuse of agencies, whether it is the income tax, ED, CBI, and a targeted vendetta. You know, you
But
are
learn
trying
from the
to
Congress, the
please,
BJP
please,
will
no,
say,
I'm
Anand
sorry.
Sharma ji.
I'm sorry. How many
The
of
Congress
their,
Bureau of
how many,
Investigation was what the BJP
how
said.
many, how
now
many,
you all are saying
no,
the same.
please allow me
This
to
was a
complete
standard
that.
practice of Congress.
Please
No,
allow me
Sharma
to
ji.
complete
Okay,
that.
I'm going to let you go.
How many of the former chief ministers or the serving chief ministers of the BJP were charge sheeted by ED and CBI during our tenure? I'm not making a comparison.
You know, this
Today, in Karnataka elections, 47 Congress candidates were raided by the income tax vigilance. 23 of them were prevented from campaigning in the final 5 days. So is that not abuse of the state power, state authority? Now, are you going to say that the BJP, which is flush with resources, it is the richest political party today in the world, it has the biggest office which any political party can claim of, and that party had all saints that none of their candidates had any IT issues and only the Congress, and you had to prevent them. So this, I say, is the abuse of authority. How many there are allegations against many of your former chief ministers. I don't want to take names here. We have said so. Charge sheets are there. Has even one FIR been registered? Has one of them been raided? So that is where we say that it is abuse of power by an authoritarian government which is intolerant of criticism. I am very clear on that. When you bring in the issue of surgical strike, I have just one appeal to make today from this studio. Please do not drag Indian army into partisan politics or propaganda. It is India's army, it defends our borders, we all salute our soldiers, they sacrifice, they protect our motherland.
Well, I think
we all took similar position. They have been, army has taken actions in the past. It's not a question of when. It is the same. Today, BJP President Amit Shah is saying that 68 years Indian army didn't do that. Don't forget Bangladesh war.
So
the
let's not
biggest
get into
victory,
which
biggest
time
victory,
the army did more.
biggest victory
not
after after the Second World War of any army, when Pakistan army surrendered.
Sure.
Indira Gandhi did not go to town to say it's my victory or my decision. Rather, she told everyone, including Parliament, when Vajpayee praised her, that it's not mine, it is the victory of humanity and it's the victory of the Indian army.
Well, I think Prime Minister Modi also doesn't say it's his victory, but let me just bring in Lalitha ji on that aspect, that when we actually look at the comparisons between Indira Gandhi and Prime Minister Modi, authoritarian, Dipankar says that's a bad thing, but many do look at these aspects, that when Indira Gandhi raised national security as a reason for the emergency, even today, when many questions are asked, the immediate answer is no, it can't be given because it's an issue of national security, or you'll be anti-national if you raise this issue. This whole thing of nationalism, if you're with the BJP or national, if you're not with the BJP, you're anti-national. The trends, in fact, when you compare two prime ministers, seem very similar.
I don't think it's if you're with the BJP, you're national. If you're not national. That's not it. I think people have different interpretations of that. But what I'd like to say is that why we hark back to the emergency is because seriously civil liberties were curbed, if not totally broken down, I mean, taken away from people during that time. You were talking about Amir Khan, Shah Rukh Khan, etc., making some comments. Now, don't forget that during the emergency, there was this film which I liked very much called Andhi. In which, yes, right, and that was banned. What? It didn't say anything bad about it. It was actually very flattering towards Indira Gandhi. Then there was the Kissa Kursi Ka thing, which also was a very nice film. But what happened to it? Sanjay Gandhi went and burnt it all up. Nothing happened. Nobody even could react. Those are things that seem to have been swept on the carpet. Fine. What happened, happened.
So do you think that won't happen again today? Do you think that, for instance, a film can't be banned today or books can't be banned today?
No. There has been several efforts, I think, but they never haven't really happened.
Let's wait till then.
Remember that even Padmavati, etc., what became Padmavat, there was this whole halla-bulla, all of that. Everybody had what they wanted to say. I'm not saying who's right, who's wrong. I'm not going into that at all. But eventually the film was released. There was space for dialogue. It wasn't just, everything wasn't just burnt. Of course, many people may have wanted to do it, but it really didn't happen. So I think it's
Can I say
really overreaching to say that Modi and Indira Gandhi were similar. I don't think so.
In 2018, do you feel an emergency-like situation can happen today as those opposed to the BJP say? Do you feel that?
The emergency-like situation can happen anytime, anywhere. Because the fact of the matter is that you can whip up anti-nationalist sentiments. You can say our borders are threatened. I mean, this is what happened during the Nehruvian period as well. So what I'm going to tell you is this, that don't let these issues overwhelm us. And what we've been talking about so far is precisely what I think was the wrong way of going about it. What we should really ask ourselves is how can we prevent this from happening in an institutional fashion? If I were to say that X is equal to Y, Y is equal to Z, what does it prove? Doesn't prove very much. I would like us to sit down and say, all these parties together, we will not let certain things happen again. We want accountability at the top level, at the bottom and the middle levels, everywhere.
Anand Sharma, can we ensure that happens? Do you feel in 2018 that anything, an emergency-like situation as Yashwant Sinha describes it, can happen again?
Well, there is an environment of fear and distrust. There is intimidation. Intimidation in institutions, intimidation in the campuses. And that's where what has been said, restoring the health of our institutions, protecting them is important. And at the same time, institutional accountability. We don't see that happening at all. We see the undermining of the institutions and subversion. One has a long list. I talked of the central agencies. You cannot have double standards, dual yardsticks. But also, you had a Niti Aayog dismantled. One can have two views on that. You will have the UGC dismantled. You will have other institutions being changed. Who are the people replacing them? You look at the list of people who are being appointed. He was talking about some professors in the university. I am afraid to say that today people belonging to the RSS, when you talk of extra constitutional authority, how would you describe RSS? It decides
well, Pranab
what the
Mukherji
policies will be.
At the RSS
that's a separate issue. That was his personal decision. But they decide that who will be the BJP chief. They have general secretaries nominated from the RSS who control the BJP organization. They sit on the dais to decide about their campaign plans, and then they yet claim that they are social and cultural organizations.
So you're saying you feel
they have infiltrated every single institution. Let RSS say that we are political, withdraw the undertaking given to Sardar Patel, withdraw the undertakings that the RSG gave to Indira Gandhi, and say that yes, we are the parent party.
Could. Dr.
That
Mukherji,
would actually clean up the Indian politics.
I'm going to come back to you.
I want to restrict I mean, I'd like to. This whole debate is about what is it that happened during the emergency that should not be repeated. And I don't think that what happened during the emergency is happening now at all. Yes, you may not agree with Mr. Modi's policies. You say he's authoritarian, etc. That everybody has the right to not agree. But then equally the people who say, look up to him and say that yes, he is this, also have the right to say it. Now, one thing has to be, I come from a family which is considered extremely leftist. I'm an anomaly even now in the family, right? And I'm sure I will be criticized the moment I get off the show. But the fact is that, you know, the situation during those 21 months was quite different from what it is now. There was no room for criticism then. Everybody was shoved in jail. Many people are making statements today. Don't forget that Yashwant Sinha was denied many things by the current party leadership. Other people too, whom I respect greatly, so I don't want to take their names. So it could be, part of it could be the sort of, you know, the anger against what I was not given what I deserved. So that could be it. And that probably is it. But the fact that they can still make such statements and nothing has been done against them itself shows that we are nowhere near like an emergency situation.
I think the space, the freedom to freedom of expression, really the right to dissent,
well, it is
alive and kicking in 2018.
I should say that still we have people who have courage of conviction to stand up and talk. Nothing would shut people like us up. We will stand up and talk.
From the fact that they haven't been arrested and shoved in jail, and their constitutional rights have been abrogated.
We have spoken.
Lalitha ji says that's because you're not being put into jail for expressing those opinions.
No,
I do have to leave the debate.
Well, I think the Prime Minister and Mr. Amit Shah are happy to do that. We have done nothing to warrant that.
I mean, but come on, that is just political talk. If they wanted to do it, they have done it by now.
Let me tell you one thing, that I have raised it in Parliament, and I have been forced now to say, I would not have even recalled, that on the floor of the House, I said something which was supported by majority of the members present. The Prime Minister was there and the Home Minister, and they had given a notice also that all our telephones are today being tapped illegally of the members of Parliament, of senior officials. It is on record in Parliament, and we had demanded, an independent probe that who has authorized our, forget about mobile phones, we are under surveillance, we are only political opponents, we are not anti-national elements, but that's being done.
Right. So important issues we've discussed, but I think everybody is agreed that 1975 to 77 will never be repeated in India today. But I think perhaps, as Professor Gupta says, let's look at each situation completely differently. India is evolving, exciting, progressive time. Let's see how we move forward. Thank you all very much for the different perspectives and for being part of this dialogue.